You're standing in the Senate chamber. The air is thick with incense and fear. Around you, the most powerful men in the world sit in silence, their faces carved from marble. Your wife was summoned an hour ago. She hasn't returned. The emperor is smiling at you from across the room, and you know that if you move, if you speak, if you even let your mask slip for a single breath, your entire family will be erased from history before sunrise. So you sit, you wait, and you pretend that your soul isn't being murdered in real time. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It's wild to me that a story this dark, from nearly 2,000 years ago, can still reach us all, no matter where we are. This was Rome in the year 39 A.D. 2 years into the reign of Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the emperor of the people had nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boots. He had come to power on a wave of hope so powerful that citizens wept in the streets. His father Germanicus had been Rome's most beloved general, a man who died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned by the paranoid emperor Tiberius. When Caligula ascended the throne at just 24 years old, Rome believed a savior had arrived. The Senate showered him with honors. The people lined the roads to catch a glimpse of their golden prince. Even the gods, it seemed, had smiled upon the empire. But within 4 years, that same prince would transform the heart of Rome into a theater of sexual horror. He would force senators to watch as he violated their wives. He would turn the imperial palace into a brothel staffed by the daughters of nobility. He would desecrate the most sacred religious vows, publicly claim godhood, and allegedly conduct incestuous relationships with his own sisters, parading one of them at state banquets as if she were his wife. The question isn't just what happened. The question is how. How does a man go from beloved son of Rome to a tyrant whose name would become synonymous with madness and depravity for the next 2 millennia? And more disturbingly, what does it reveal about power itself? The first crack in Caligula's facade appeared not in the Senate, not in the military, but within the walls of his own family. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what family meant to a Roman. The Domasta household was the foundation of civilization itself. A man's authority over his family was considered sacred, a microcosm of the emperor's authority over the empire. The family was where virtue was taught, where honor was preserved, where the future was born. To violate the family was to violate the cosmic order. Caligula had 3 sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla. They were not just his siblings, they were political assets, living symbols of the Julio-Claudian dynasty's legitimacy. But according to the ancient historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Caligula treated them as something else entirely. He allegedly engaged in sexual relationships with all 3, but his obsession with Drusilla transcended even that taboo. He seated her beside him at state functions in the position traditionally reserved for an empress. He gave her honors that belonged only to a wife. He made senators bow to her as if she were royalty of a different order. This wasn't hidden. This wasn't rumor whispered in dark corners. This was policy. This was spectacle. Caligula was performing his violation of natural law in front of the entire Roman elite, daring them to challenge him. And when Drusilla died suddenly in 38 A, possibly from fever, though some whispered poison Caligula's grief was so extreme that it bordered on performance art, he declared a period of public mourning for the entire empire. He had her deified, elevated to goddess status, with temples erected in her honor and priests appointed to her cult. He forced Rome to worship the woman he had allegedly been sleeping with as his sister. Think about what that means. He didn't just break the law. He made Rome kneel before his crime and call it holy. He transformed incest into state religion. The message was unmistakable. The rules that govern you do not govern me. The laws of gods and men bend in my presence. But if Caligula could so casually destroy the sanctity of his own blood, what chance did anyone else have? His next target was the institution that had ruled Rome for centuries, the Senate. These were not weak men. These were former generals, provincial governors, men whose ancestors had conquered nations. They had wealth, armies of clients, and the weight of history behind them. Caligula understood something crucial. You don't break powerful men by killing them. You break them by making them complicit in their own humiliation. The Senate sessions became something out of a fever dream. In the middle of debates over taxation or military policy, Caligula would casually interrupt a comment on a senator's wife, her figure, her beauty, her potential. Sometimes he would simply stand, walk down from his throne, and summon her from the gallery where the women sat. The senator would freeze. Every eye in the chamber would be on him. His wife would descend the marble steps, Caligula would take her hand, and they would disappear into the private chambers adjacent to the Senate floor. Minutes would pass, then an hour. The Senate would continue its business discussions of grain supplies, diplomatic treaties, provincial appointments, while one of their own sat among them, knowing that his wife was being raped in the next room. When she finally returned, pale and silent, the senator was expected to thank the emperor for his attention, to express gratitude for the honor, to smile and nod, and continue voting on legislation as if his entire identity as a man, a husband, and a Roman hadn't just been obliterated. This was systematic. This was policy. Caligula kept a mental catalog of senators' wives, rating them openly at banquets, comparing them like horses at auction. He would take a woman to his chambers, then return to the dining hall and announce a detailed critique of her performance to the entire room, including her husband. He would describe her body, her responses, her alleged enthusiasm or lack thereof, all while the man who had sworn before the gods to protect her sat frozen, trapped between rage and terror. To object meant death, possibly for his entire family. To endure meant surrendering every shred of dignity that made him human. Suetonius records that Caligula would sometimes send out formal invitations to married women, summoning them to the palace as if for a state function. Their husbands would receive no explanation, no warning. Hours later, the women would return with the emperor's assessment publicly posted in the form a ranking of their performance. A score, a review, as if they were entertainers at a festival. The psychological warfare was exquisite. Caligula had discovered that you don't need dungeons and torture devices when you can turn a man's honor into a weapon against himself. But why stop at individual humiliations when you can industrialize the degradation? Caligula transformed entire sections of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hiltha, symbolic heart of Roman authority, into a functioning brothel. But this was no ordinary establishment. The women forced to work there were not common prostitutes from the Subura district. They were the wives and daughters of senators, equestrians, and noble families. Caligula appointed himself as Rome's imperial pimp, setting prices and sending out official invitations to men of rank, commanding them to attend and spend their money. Imagine receiving that invitation. You are a senator. Your daughter is being held in the palace. The message is clear. Come pay for your own daughter's degradation, or she will suffer worse. Men arrived in formal togas, handed over gold coins, and were ushered into rooms where their friends' wives, their colleagues' daughters, were waiting. The palace, once the seat of law and justice, became a marketplace where the currency was shattered dignity and the profit was pure terror. The symbolism was too perfect to be accidental. The heart of the empire was now a house of shame, and its master was the emperor himself. But Caligula's ambitions extended beyond earthly power. He declared himself a living god Jupiter, incarnate and demanded worship. Temples were erected in his honor. Statues of him replaced statues of traditional deities. He would dress in the costumes of various gods, Jupiter, Apollo, Mercury, and conduct state business while demanding that senators address him by divine titles. This wasn't megalomania for its own sake. It was a calculated theological coup. If he was a god, then his actions were by definition sacred. To question him was blasphemy. To resist him was to war against heaven itself. And if he was divine, then even the most sacred vows meant nothing before him. The Vestal Virgins priestesses, sworn to 30 years of chastity, guardians of Rome's eternal flame, were supposed to be untouchable. To violate a Vestal was one of the gravest sins in Roman religion, punishable by being buried alive. For Caligula, this made them an irresistible target. According to the ancient sources, he allegedly seduced or forced himself upon at least one of them, possibly more. The act was less about desire than demonstration. If even the guardians of Rome's soul were not safe, then no one was. No vow was sacred. No boundary existed. He had become, in his own twisted logic, more powerful than the gods he claimed to embody. The cruelty wasn't confined to the elite. For every senator whose wife was violated, there were dozens of slaves and servants who suffered in silence. The ancient historians rarely recorded their names. Slave suffering was considered background noise, not worthy of detailed documentation. But we can reconstruct the horror. A young slave girl, perhaps 12 or 13, summoned to the emperor's chambers in the middle of the night. No witnesses, no appeals, no hope. A kitchen servant, grabbed in a corridor, used, and returned to his duties with the implicit understanding that, to speak of it, was death. Their bodies were considered property, their consent legally irrelevant, their suffering invisible. Even public spectacles became venues for sexual domination. At the gladiatorial games, while tens of thousands watched men kill each other in the arena below. Caligula would conduct his own games in the imperial box. He would fondle noblewomen in full view of the crowd, give explicit orders to wives seated near him, force humiliating acts from women whose husbands sat paralyzed a few seats away. The arena was filled with the performance of death. The imperial box was the site of a different kind of murder, the murder of dignity, of self-worth, of identity itself. Perhaps the most shocking incident involved a nobleman named Gaius Piso, who was in the process of marrying a woman named Livia Orestilla. The wedding was a grand affair, attended by Rome's elite. In the middle of the ceremony, as vows were being exchanged, as the sacred rites were being performed, Caligula stood up, walked to the altar, and announced that he was taking the bride for himself. The wedding continued with a different groom. Livia Orestilla became Empress of Rome for approximately 48 hours before Caligula divorced her and had her exiled. The act was pure nihilism. He hadn't wanted her particularly. He simply wanted to demonstrate that no promise, no vow, no future was safe from his momentary impulse. So why did Rome endure this? Why didn't the Senate act? Why didn't the army rebel? The answer is the same in every age: Fear is the most powerful force in human politics. Caligula had the Praetorian Guard, 10,000 elite soldiers whose loyalty he bought with bonuses and whose cruelty he encouraged. He had a network of informant slaves, freedmen, even senators who traded information for survival. Every whisper was potentially treason. Every gathering was potentially a conspiracy. The punishment for treason was imaginative and public, crucifixion being sewn into a sack with animals and thrown into the Tiber, being fed to wild beasts in the arena. Entire families were erased for the suspicion of disloyalty. The Senate, once the proud guardian of republican virtue, became a collection of broken men who applauded their own humiliation. They voted Caligula honors, erected statues in his name, and composed poetry celebrating his divine wisdom, all while knowing that their wives might be summoned at any moment. Their daughters conscripted into the palace brothel, their sons killed on a whim. Rome was a city in psychological paralysis, where survival meant the daily murder of your own soul. But systems built on pure terror contained the seeds of their own destruction. Fear is a powerful tool, but it's also unstable. It requires constant escalation, and eventually the escalation reaches someone who decides that death is preferable to another day of humiliation. That person was Cassius Chaerea, a tribune in the Praetorian Guard. Chaerea was a decorated veteran, a man who had served Rome with distinction, but he had a high-pitched voice, and Caligula found this hilarious. Every day, when Chaerea would approach for the watchword, the daily password that allowed the guard to operate, Caligula would give him sexually explicit terms, mocking his voice, questioning his manhood in front of his subordinates. It was a small humiliation compared to what others suffered, but it was constant, it was personal, and it was the spark. Chaerea began quietly recruiting. He found senators whose wives had been violated, officers whose dignity had been shredded, palace servants who had endured too much in silence. The conspiracy grew slowly, carefully, in whispered conversations and meaningful glances. They waited for the perfect moment. It came during the Palatine Games in January of 41 AD. Caligula was moving through a private underground corridor beneath the palace, heading back to his chambers after the morning's events. The corridor was narrow, lined with columns, away from the main crowds. Chaerea and his fellow conspirators were waiting. They surrounded him. There was a moment, one brief, suspended moment, when the living god realized he was mortal after all. Then the daggers came, 30 wounds. Caligula died on the marble floor of his own palace. The conspirators didn't stop there. They went to Caligula's chambers and found his wife, Caesonia, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla. They killed them both. The entire imperial family was erased in a single afternoon. Rome's reaction was complex. There was relief, certainly. The nightmare was over. But there was also confusion, fear of civil war, and something darker, collective shame at what they had allowed to happen. The Senate briefly debated restoring the Republic, but the idea died within hours. They were too broken, too accustomed to subjugation. Instead, they found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and made him emperor. Rome would remain an empire. The monarchy would continue. They had learned nothing except that one tyrant could be replaced by another. But Caligula left scars that time couldn't heal. The senators who had survived carried the memory of their humiliation to their graves. The women who had been violated had no voice in history, their suffering, recorded only as a footnote to male political drama. The slaves and servants who had endured the worst returned to invisibility, their trauma considered irrelevant to the historical record. The Vestal virgins continued their sacred duties, the sanctity of their vows, forever compromised by the knowledge that even the most holy oath could be violated by a man with enough power. What Caligula proved, in the most visceral way possible, is that power doesn't corrupt gradually, it reveals instantly. The capacity for cruelty was always there, in the child wearing little boots, in the young prince weeping at his father's funeral. The throne didn't create the monster. It simply removed every barrier between impulse and action, between fantasy and reality. When a human being is given absolute power and told he is a god, the question isn't whether he will abuse it. The question is how long until the people he rules decide that mortality is preferable to divinity. There's a detail that survived in the historical record, small but haunting. After Caligula's assassination, when workers were cleaning out his private chambers, they found lists, carefully maintained lists of names, senators, their wives, their daughters, with notes beside each one, ratings, schedules, plans. The sexual tyranny that had seemed chaotic and impulsive was actually meticulously organized. The madness had a method. The cruelty had a system. Caligula wasn't out of control. He was perfectly, terrifyingly in control. He knew exactly what he was doing. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing revelation of all. The story of Caligula isn't just ancient history, it's a recurring nightmare that every society must guard against, the nightmare of what happens when the boundaries that make us human are stripped away by unchecked authority. Rome survived Caligula, but it never recovered the innocence it had before he ascended the throne. The city learned that civilization is thinner than we imagine, that the distance between a republic and a brothel is only as wide as the integrity of those in power. Somewhere in Rome today, there's a corridor beneath the Palatine Hill where tourists walk without knowing what happened there. The marble is the same marble that absorbed the blood of a god who died like a man. The stones remember, even if we've forgotten. They remember the senators who sat in silence, the women who endured in darkness, the slaves whose names were never recorded. They remember that power, when given to the wrong hands, doesn't just corrupt it, consumes everything it touches, until all that's left is ruins and the echo of screaming in the dark.